Welcome to Dusk and Empires. Tonight, we visit a Pennsylvania town where the streets are empty, the houses still stand, and beneath the ground, a fire has been burning continuously since 1962, outlasting the people who once called it home. If this sounds like your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let history carry you to sleep. Opening meditation. Close your eyes, if they are not already closed. Let your body settle into whatever surface is holding you right now. Feel its weight. Feel the warmth beneath you. Notice the quiet of wherever you are, the hum of a distant room, the faint sound of the night outside, the slow rhythm of your own breathing. Somewhere in the mountains of eastern Pennsylvania, there is a road that leads almost nowhere. It is a road that was once full of life, lined with houses, with churches, with the sound of children running across wooden porches on summer evenings. There was the smell of coal smoke and kitchen bread. There were men walking home from a long shift underground, their boots heavy, their faces marked with the dark dust of the earth. There were women hanging laundry in the cool morning air, watching the hills rise green and ancient all around them. That road is mostly empty now. And the question of how a living, breathing town simply fades from the map, that is a question worth sitting with, slowly, on a quiet night like this one. Let your breathing slow just a little more. There is nowhere to be. There is nothing to do. There is only this story, unfolding gently, like smoke rising from the ground on a cold autumn morning. Part 1: The Mountain and the Seam. Before the town, there was the mountain. Long before anyone arrived with picks and lanterns and the slow machinery of industry, the hills of what would become Columbia County, Pennsylvania sat in a particular kind of silence. They were old hills, old in the way that Appalachian geology makes things old. Not sharp and dramatic like mountains further west, but worn and rounded by time, covered in forest that changed color with every season and offered very little in the way of easy passage. In winter, those hills gathered snow quietly, holding it in the folds of the landscape like a grandmother holds something precious and familiar. Beneath those hills, laid down over 300 million years ago, was something that would change everything. Anthracite coal. This was not the soft, crumbling bituminous coal found in other parts of the country. Anthracite was something different entirely. It was dense and black and hard as stone. It burned slowly and cleanly, or as cleanly as any coal burns, and it gave off a tremendous heat. It was the kind of fuel that could warm an entire row of city houses through a Pennsylvania winter. It was the kind of fuel that industry in the 19th century desperately needed. The anthracite seams that ran through Columbia County were among the richest in the entire region. They ran in broad, irregular bands through the earth, dipping and rising with the contours of the hills, sometimes coming close to the surface and sometimes plunging deep. The seam that would eventually matter most in the story of Centralia, a seam that would carry fire and ruin in equal measure, was called the Buck Mountain Seam. It ran like a dark river beneath the landscape, thick and dense, packed with the compressed energy of ancient forests. But in the early years, those seams were unknown to the people who would come to work them. The hills were simply hills. The forests were simply forests. And the ground beneath was simply the ground. The first European settlers to move through this part of Pennsylvania were largely passing through, following trails that indigenous peoples had used for centuries, moving west and north in search of farmland. The land here was not especially welcoming to agriculture. The hills were too steep, the soil too thin and rocky in many places, the winters too long. Settlement was sparse and slow. It was not until the first decades of the 19th century that the situation began to change, not because of farming, but because of what lay beneath the farms. The discovery and development of the anthracite coal fields of eastern and central Pennsylvania was one of the most consequential industrial events in American history. It did not happen all at once, and it was not the work of any single person or company. It was a gradual recognition, spreading through the region like the news of something remarkable that everyone eventually needed to know. Engineers and speculators and small-time investors began mapping the seams, calculating their depth and breadth, hiring men to sink the first tentative shafts into the hillsides. And with the mines came the miners. The people who came to work the anthracite fields of Pennsylvania in the mid-19th century came from many places. Welsh miners, who had worked coal in the mountains of their homeland for generations and who brought with them specific skills and specific songs and a specific way of organizing underground labor. Irish immigrants, arriving in enormous numbers after the famines of the 1840s, hungry and willing to take whatever work was available, even work that sent them into the dark earth for 12 hours at a stretch. Germans and Poles and Lithuanians and Ukrainians would follow in later decades, each community adding its own particular texture to the towns that grew around the mines. They came because the mines offered something, not comfort, exactly, and not safety, and not ease, but wages. A way to survive. And for many of them, after the crossings they had endured and the losses they had suffered, survival felt like something worth celebrating. The town that would become Centralia began as a quiet settlement in the 1840s and 1850s, tucked into a narrow valley in the Locust Mountain Range. The original name for the place was Centerville, though the Postal Service would eventually insist on the change to Centralia because another Centerville already existed in the state. It was a small adjustment, 2 letters added, the feel of the word slightly altered, but names carry weight, and Centralia would carry its name into history in ways that no one who lived there in those early years could have imagined. The town grew in the way that coal towns tended to grow, not elegantly planned, but organically accumulating. A mine opening would draw workers, workers would need housing, housing would need stores, stores would draw more families would build churches, churches would anchor a community, and suddenly there was a town where there had been only a hillside. The main road through town followed the natural contour of the valley. On either side, wooden frame houses were built in rows, close together, sharing the practical warmth of proximity. There were gardens where women grew beans and tomatoes and herbs that reminded them of somewhere else. There were outbuildings and small barns and the particular clutter of working-class rural life, stacked wood, mended tools, the evidence of careful resourcefulness. At the center of the community's life were not the mines themselves, the mines were a necessity, not a gathering place, but the churches. This was a profoundly religious community. The Catholics built St. Ignatius, which would grow into a substantial stone church with a tall steeple that could be seen from the surrounding hills. The Welsh miners brought their Methodism and their tradition of singing 4-part harmonies that rose from Sunday services and echoed off the valley walls. The Orthodox communities, arriving later, built their own beautiful churches, with domed rooflines that seemed to carry the memory of Eastern Europe into this American mountain valley. Centralia at its peak, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was home to over 2,000 people. It had hotels and taverns and a post office and a volunteer fire company and schools and a baseball team. It had the particular, irreplaceable texture of a real place, the accumulated weight of generations living alongside one another, sharing the ordinary moments that make up a life. And all of it sat above that seam of coal. The coal that had brought everyone there, the coal that fed the furnaces of American industry, the coal that paid for every loaf of bread and every school textbook and every Sunday dress, that same coal was running through the ground beneath every house, beneath the churches, beneath the roads. The relationship between a mining town and its mine is one of the most complex and intimate relationships that humans have ever organized. The mine gives everything. And the mine, eventually, takes something back. But in those early years, on those quiet evenings when the shift was done and the lanterns were lit in the windows and the smell of supper drifted out onto the front porches, in those years, the mountain felt like a partner, not a threat. It would take more than a century for that to change. Part 2: The Life of a Coal Town. Imagine, for a moment, waking before the sun in Centralia on a winter morning in, say, 1910. The air in the bedroom is cold enough to see your breath. The window glass is frosted on the inside, and the light that filters through it is the particular pale gray of winter dawn at elevation. From somewhere below, you can hear the sound of a cast iron stove being opened, coal being fed in, the creak and adjustment of the old house as it begins to warm. The smell of coal heat is very specific, not unpleasant, but dense and mineral, a smell that speaks of the Earth's interior. In a mining town like Centralia, this smell was everywhere, always. It came from every chimney, every stove, every furnace. It was the smell of home. It was the smell of work. It was, in a strange way, the smell of the place itself. The men who worked the mines of Centralia and the surrounding region had lives organized around the rhythms of underground labor in ways that are now difficult to fully imagine. Mining in the anthracite region in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was an extraordinary physical undertaking. The miners descended into shafts dug into the hillsides, what were called drift mines, which entered the seam horizontally and worked in chambers carved from the coal itself. The ceilings were low. The light came from small oil lamps worn on their caps. The air was thick with coal dust, and the sound was the sound of pick against stone, of timber creaking under the weight of the mountain above. The work was measured not in hours but in tons. Many miners were paid by the amount of coal they produced, which meant that the incentive was always to work faster, push harder, take fewer breaks. It also meant that the relationship between a miner and his company was rarely simple or easy. The miners knew the value of what they extracted. They also knew that the risks they took were not always reflected in their wages. The labor history of the anthracite region is inseparable from the story of organized coal mining in America. The United Mine Workers of America drew enormous strength from the Pennsylvania fields. Strikes that rocked the coal industry, including the famous anthracite strike of 1902, which involved over 140,000 miners and lasted nearly 5 months, had direct echoes in towns like Centralia, where men weighed the certainty of a wage against the possibility of something better. But the labor disputes, as significant as they were not the only drama playing out in the mining communities. There was also simply the daily human texture of the place, and that texture was remarkably rich. The ethnic communities of Centralia had settled into distinct but overlapping neighborhoods, each with its own character. The Welsh families, many of them among the oldest established residents, had a particular cultural pride tied to their language and their music. Welsh was still spoken in some households well into the 20th century, a remnant of a world carried across the ocean and transplanted into these mountains. The choral tradition, the Eisteddfod, the competitive singing festival, was observed with genuine passion. The Lithuanian and Slovak communities, who had arrived in larger numbers in the 1880s and 1890s, brought with them the customs of Central and Eastern Europe, elaborate holiday celebrations, specific foods prepared in specific ways, a religious calendar that ordered the entire year. The feast days of particular saints were marked with special foods and church observances and a kind of communal joy that was both pious and practical. These celebrations were not merely religious in the abstract sense, they were the social glue of the community, the events that brought everyone together, that gave shape to the year and meaning to the weeks in between. The taverns and hotels of Centralia, and at its peak, there were quite a few, were central to the social life of the male population in a way that is sometimes misunderstood. Yes, they were places where men drank. But they were also places where men talked, where news was exchanged, where labor organizing happened in the back rooms, where the politics of the day were debated with the particular intensity of people who had direct stakes in the outcomes. The tavern was the informal parliament of the working-class community. The women of Centralia, meanwhile, maintained a world that was no less important for being less visible in the historical record. They managed households that required genuine skill and considerable physical effort. Coal fires needed constant attention. Food preservation, canning, pickling, drying was not optional but essential. Medical care for children happened at home, in kitchens and bedrooms, without the luxury of easy access to hospitals. The women organized the churches, the schools, the charity networks that caught families when disaster struck, and in a mining community, disasters struck with terrible regularity. Mining accidents were a constant presence in the life of a coal town. Cave-ins, explosions, flooding, the slow accumulation of lung disease from breathing coal dust for years, these were not rare occurrences but expected hazards. Every family in Centralia either had direct experience of a mining accident or knew families that did. The sound of the mine emergency whistle, a sound that carried across the valley and into every kitchen and bedroom and schoolroom, was one of the most dreaded sounds in a miner's family's life. It meant something had gone wrong underground. It meant that someone might not be coming home. The Centralia Mine Rescue Station, established in the early 20th century as safety regulations slowly improved, was a point of local pride, a sign that the community took its obligations to its workers seriously, or at least more seriously than had been the case in earlier, more brutal decades. But the mines of the Centralia area were also genuinely productive, and for long stretches, they operated with the steady rhythm of successful enterprise. The coal came out of the earth, was loaded onto railroad cars, and traveled to markets in Philadelphia and New York and Baltimore. It heated city homes and powered factories and fueled the engines of American industrial growth in ways that were rarely acknowledged by the people who ultimately benefited from that coal, the city dwellers who turned up their thermostats and thought very little about what lay beneath someone else's town. The railroad was the artery that connected Centralia to the wider world. The Lehigh Valley Railroad and the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad both had lines in the region, and the arrival and departure of trains gave a particular rhythm to the day. Goods came in on those trains: fabric, tools, medicines, newspapers, all the connective tissue of modern life. And coal went out. The children of Centralia grew up with the mountain in their blood. They played in the woods on the hillsides above the town, building forts in the undergrowth, following the small streams that cut through the valleys. They went to schools where the teachers, often local women who had pursued education as one of the few available paths to professional life, taught them reading and arithmetic and history and the particular civic pride that characterized American public education in the early 20th century. Those children grew into adults who stayed, in many cases. The children of miners became miners. The children of the women who ran the church auxiliaries became the women who ran the church auxiliaries. Families put down deep roots in Centralia, roots that intertwine with the roots of other families across generations of marriages and friendships and shared catastrophes and shared celebrations. This is what made what eventually happened to Centralia so particular and so painful. It was not just a town that was destroyed. It was a web of human connection, layers and layers of it, accumulated over more than a century, that was slowly, inexorably, quietly dismantled. But that dismantling was still, in the early 20th century, far away. The town was alive. The mines were working. The children were playing on the hillsides. And the coal seam beneath the ground was simply waiting. Part 3: The First Signs of Trouble. There is a particular kind of unease that comes before you understand what is wrong. You notice something, a smell that shouldn't be there, a patch of ground that seems warmer than it should, a place where the snow melts faster than anywhere nearby. Your mind reaches for explanations. A broken pipe, perhaps. Something left running in the basement. A loose connection somewhere. The ordinary world offers ordinary explanations, and for a while, those explanations seem sufficient. The history of the Centralia mine fire is, in one sense, the history of a community reaching for ordinary explanations when the truth was something far more extraordinary and far more dangerous. To understand the fire, it is necessary to understand something about how anthracite coal is mined, and more specifically, how it was mined in the Centralia region over more than a century of operations. The underground workings of the mines around Centralia were extensive, a labyrinthine network of tunnels and chambers carved through the coal seams over decades, stretching beneath the town and the surrounding hillsides in directions and dimensions that were not always completely mapped or well understood. As the mines were worked out, as the accessible coal was extracted, the tunnels were left behind. Old mine workings fill gradually with gases, with water, with the slow settling of unsupported ground. They also fill with something else, coal refuse, the small pieces and dust that are left behind in the extraction process. This material, sometimes called culm, is not pure coal but contains enough carbon to be combustible under the right conditions. On the surface of the ground near Centralia, as in most mining towns of the era, there were mine refuse piles, enormous mounds of waste material from the mining process, accumulated over decades. These piles were not beautiful. They were not intended to be beautiful. They were the byproduct of extraction, the dark hills of rejection material that surrounded the working mines and gave coal towns their particular industrial landscape. One of these refuse piles, near the town's landfill area on the outskirts of Centralia, would become the starting point for what historians and geologists now recognize as one of the longest burning underground coal fires in recorded history. The exact origin of the Centralia mine fire has been the subject of considerable debate over the decades, and that debate itself is part of the story, because the question of who or what started the fire is entangled with questions of responsibility and culpability that have never been entirely resolved. What is generally established is this: in May of 1962, a fire was set in the Centralia landfill area. The landfill, operated by the town, was located in an old strip mine pit near the edge of town, a common arrangement in small communities of that era, where old mine workings were repurposed as disposal sites. The fire was set deliberately, as part of the routine practice of burning the garbage in the landfill to reduce its volume. This was standard procedure, not reckless, not unusual, simply the way things were done. What was not fully appreciated, or perhaps not appreciated at all, was the proximity of that burning to the coal seam beneath. The pit where the landfill was located connected, through various passages and fissures in the ground, to the old mine workings. And the mine workings were full of coal. The fire did not stop at the landfill. It found its way into the coal seam, through the gap between the burning refuse and the rock below, carried by the heat and the oxygen that circulated through the tunnels. And once it reached the coal, it found exactly the conditions it needed to persist and spread: abundant fuel, a steady if limited supply of air moving through the old mine passages, and a total absence of human intervention that could reach it. Fighting a fire underground, particularly a fire in a coal seam, is an entirely different challenge from fighting a fire on the surface. You cannot simply pour water on it. You cannot surround it and suffocate it easily, because the seam extends in all directions and the air pathways through the old workings are too numerous and too complex to block completely. The fire moves through the coal at its own pace, following the seam, finding new fuel, generating gases, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, that rise through fissures and cracks to the surface above. Early attempts were made to address the Centralia fire. Workers dug trenches in an attempt to cut off the fire's advance. They pumped water and slurry, a mixture of water and fine material, into the burning areas. They drilled boreholes to try to inject material that would smother the flames. Some of these efforts had partial effects, slowing the fire in certain directions, but none of them stopped it. Each time an excavation or injection seemed to be making progress, the fire would find another path through the labyrinthine old workings. The problem was compounded by the same geographic and geological complexity that had made Centralia's mines productive in the first place. The coal seams ran in irregular patterns. The old mine tunnels had been dug over a century of operations by many different companies, with varying standards of record-keeping. The maps of the underground workings were incomplete. The connections between different parts of the system were not always known. Fighting the fire was, in a very real sense, fighting an enemy whose territory you could not fully see. In those first years after 1962, the fire was a local problem, acknowledged, concerning, being addressed in the ways that seemed available. The people of Centralia continued their lives. Children went to school. Men worked the remaining active mines in the area. Women tended their gardens and their households. The town's institutions continued to function. But some people noticed things. An unusual warmth in a particular spot in someone's yard. A patch of ground where the snow consistently melted faster than the surroundings. A smell in the basement faint at first, something that might be a gas leak from an old appliance, or the odor of something damp and organic, or simply the particular mustiness of an old house. A crack appearing in a sidewalk where no crack had been before. These observations were easy to dismiss, at first. The ordinary explanations seemed sufficient. Houses settle. Ground shifts. Old pipes corrode. The mind is remarkably good at integrating small anomalies into an acceptable picture of normality, especially when the alternative explanation, the real one, is so vast and strange that it requires a complete rethinking of what the ground beneath your home actually is. The town government and various state and federal agencies were aware of the fire throughout the 1960s and 1970s, and there was a long, complicated sequence of assessments, proposals, and debates about what to do. The cost of the most comprehensive solution, a full excavation of the burning area, removing the coal and refuse that was fueling the fire, was estimated to be in the millions of dollars. That estimate was considered prohibitive. The funds were not available. The urgency, to those not living directly above the fire, did not seem sufficient to justify the expense. And so the fire continued to burn. Slowly. Quietly. invisibly, spreading through the scene by feet and yards, year by year, decade by decade, generating its invisible gases, warming the ground from below, moving toward the center of town. What no one fully understood yet, or perhaps, what no one was ready to fully acknowledge, was that the fire was not a temporary problem to be managed until the next budget cycle. It was a permanent feature of the landscape now. The coal seam was burning, and it would continue to burn for as long as there was coal to burn, which, by geological estimates, meant potentially another century or more. Centralia was sitting on top of a fire that would outlast everyone who had ever lived there. But in the late 1960s and through most of the 1970s, that truth had not yet fully arrived. Life continued. The seasons changed. The hills turned green and gold and bare and white again. The ground beneath the town grew slowly, invisibly warmer. Part 4. The community above the fire. There is something worth pausing on when we consider the years that Centralia continued as a functioning community above a burning coal seam. It would be easy, from a distance of decades, to wonder why people stayed. Why they didn't simply leave the moment the fire was confirmed, the moment the first gases were detected, the moment the first sinkholes opened. But that framing misses something essential about what it means to live somewhere, what it means to be from somewhere, and what it costs to leave. Centralia, by the 1960s and 1970s, was not a wealthy community. The anthracite coal industry, which had been the economic engine of the region for more than a century, had been in decline since the end of World War II. The shift to other energy sources, oil, natural gas, and eventually electricity, had reduced the demand for anthracite coal dramatically. Mines throughout the region had closed. Jobs had disappeared. Many younger residents had already left for larger cities in search of work. The population of Centralia had fallen from its peak of well over 2,000 to somewhere around 1,000 by the 1960s. Those who remained were, in many cases, the older generations, people who had built their lives in Centralia, who owned their homes outright, who had their community networks, their churches, their friendships of 40 or 50 years. For these residents, the practical question of leaving was not simply a matter of choice. Where would they go? How would they pay for new housing somewhere else? What would they leave behind? A house in Centralia, even a well-maintained, modest family home, was not worth a great deal of money on the open market. The coal industry's decline had depressed property values throughout the region. If you sold your home and took what you could get, you might not have enough to buy comparable housing anywhere else. You might, quite literally, have nowhere to go. These were real constraints, not failures of imagination or courage. And they existed alongside other, more intangible but equally real constraints: the weight of memory, the difficulty of uprooting a life, the stubborn human attachment to place. The churches of Centralia, particularly St. Ignatius Roman Catholic Church, which had served the community since 1866, were much more than places of worship in the abstract sense. They were the anchors of social life, the repositories of community history, the places where baptisms and weddings and funerals had taken place across generations of the same families. The cemetery beside St. Ignatius held the graves of grandparents and parents and children lost in mining accidents and flu epidemics. For a community with deep religious roots, the proximity to those graves was not a trivial matter. It was a form of communion with the dead, a way of maintaining the continuity of family and faith across the boundary of mortality. So the people of Centralia stayed. And they continued to live the life of the town as best they could, even as the evidence of the fire grew more difficult to ignore. The 1970s brought significant changes to the situation. Carbon monoxide levels began to be detected in basements and ground floor rooms of houses in certain parts of town. Carbon monoxide is odorless and colorless, you cannot smell it, cannot see it. It is a silent danger, the kind that can incapacitate you before you realize anything is wrong. The discovery that homes in Centralia were being infiltrated by carbon monoxide from the burning coals seen below was a different order of alarm than the abstract knowledge of a fire underground. The Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Resources began monitoring the situation more closely. Boreholes were drilled and samples taken. Temperature measurements showed that the ground in certain areas was far warmer than it should have been. In some spots, the soil temperature at shallow depths was well above the freezing point even in the depths of winter, and the heat that radiating upward was measurable and increasing. Steam and smoke began to appear from cracks in the ground in the wooded areas on the hillsides above town. These vents, openings in the rock through which the combustion gases from the burning seam escaped, gave the landscape around Centralia a distinctly otherworldly quality. On cold winter mornings, the wisps of vapor rising from the hillside cracks looked, from a distance, like the breath of something buried and enormous, something patient and unhurried and beyond the power of ordinary human intervention. Residents in the most affected parts of town installed carbon monoxide detectors in their homes. Some kept the detectors on a shelf in the kitchen or the bedroom, checking them with the same matter-of-fact regularity with which they might check a barometer or a thermometer. This normalized the extraordinary. The carbon monoxide monitor became, for some Centralia families, simply another household object, a concession to the unusual circumstances of their particular address. Political action began to stir. Residents formed committees and advocacy groups, pressing state and federal agencies for a comprehensive solution. Letters were written to state legislators, to the Department of the Interior, to the Environmental Protection Agency. Community meetings were held in the church halls and fire company buildings of Centralia, tense and emotional gatherings where residents debated what was happening, who was responsible, and what needed to be done. The meetings were not always harmonious. The community of Centralia, like any real community, was not a monolithic block of opinion. Some residents wanted aggressive action from the government, full excavation of the burning area, an immediate solution funded by federal dollars, a resolution that would allow them to stay in their homes without fear. Others were skeptical that any solution was possible, and had already begun to accept, quietly and painfully, that the town might not survive. And there were those who refused to accept either conclusion, who simply wanted to be left alone to live their lives in the place they had always lived, fire or no fire. These divisions would deepen in the years to come. They would be complicated by government proposals that seemed to some residents like salvation and to others like condemnation. They would be sharpened by grief and fear and the particular frustration of feeling that the decisions about your life were being made by people who did not live your life. But in the middle and late 1970s, Centralia was still, in a meaningful sense, a town. It had a mayor and a town council. It had children in its schools. It had the volunteer fire company, whose members, with considerable historical irony, were tasked with fighting fires in a town that contained a fire they had no means to fight. It had its churches and its taverns and its small community events, the rituals of ordinary life that persisted even as the ground beneath them grew warmer. There is something deeply human in that persistence. Something that refuses to be dismissed or condescended to. The people of Centralia knew their town was in trouble. They knew the fire was real. They were not naive, and they were not in denial in any simple sense. They were living in the gap between a known danger and an unknown solution, making the choices that people make when the choices available to them are all imperfect. They kept their candles lit. They kept their doors open. They kept each other company in the particular way of people who had shared a long time in a small place. The fire kept burning. Part 5: The Incident That Changed Everything. Sometimes it is not the slow accumulation of danger that forces a crisis, but a single moment, specific, sudden, undeniable, that makes the abstract suddenly and terribly concrete. In Centralia, that moment came on a cold February morning in 1981. A boy named Todd Domboski was 12 years old. He was the kind of boy who existed in every small American town in that era, energetic and curious, spending his winter Saturday mornings outdoors in the way that children in small towns did, ranging freely through the familiar geography of home. On the morning of February 14, 1981, Valentine's Day, as it happened, Todd was in his grandmother's backyard, in the section of Centralia near Locust Avenue, an area that sat directly above some of the most active portions of the burning coal seam. The ground gave way beneath him. Todd Domboski fell into a sinkhole that opened suddenly in the earth, a void that had formed as the burning coal seam below ate away at the material above, leaving a hollow space with nothing but a thin crust of soil and snow over an emptiness. The sinkhole was approximately 4 feet wide and this detail matters, because it speaks to how close the situation had come to being fatal. It was approximately 150 feet deep. Todd was caught. His cousin James, who was present, grabbed his arm and held on as Todd dangled over the void, his feet finding no purchase on the crumbling edges of the hole, his hands gripping James's with the complete and focused strength of a child who understands, in the most immediate and physical way possible, that he is in genuine danger. James held on. Todd was pulled out. When investigators tested the atmosphere inside the sinkhole, the air rising from that void in the earth, they found carbon monoxide levels of 1,000 parts per million. The level considered immediately dangerous to human life is around 1,200 parts per million. The air inside that hole was not quite immediately lethal. It was close. The story of Todd Domboski's near death in his grandmother's backyard became national news. It is worth thinking about why this particular incident, out of all the documented evidence of the Centralia fire over the previous 2 decades, was the one that finally captured the sustained attention of the national press and the political establishment. Sinkholes had appeared before in Centralia. Carbon monoxide had been detected. Steam had risen from the ground. But a 12-year-old boy, almost swallowed by the earth on a winter morning, offered something that maps of underground temperature readings and tables of gas concentration data could not: a human face, a child's face, on a danger that had been too abstract for too long. The coverage that followed Todd Domboski's story brought Centralia to the attention of an American public that had largely been unaware of the situation. Newspaper articles appeared in the major dailies. Television news crews arrived in town, their cameras capturing the steam rising from the hillsides, the cracked and settled ground, the surreal combination of ordinary housefronts and extraordinary geological instability. The images were striking, almost cinematic in their strangeness. A quiet residential street, looking like countless quiet residential streets across America, except that wisps of smoke curled from the ground in the background. Congress took notice. The federal government, which had been peripherally involved in the Centralia situation since the early 1970s through various agencies and grant programs, now became significantly more engaged. Hearings were held. Estimates of the scope of the problem and the cost of various solutions were commissioned and debated. By this point, the comprehensive excavation solution that had been discussed and rejected in the early 1960s was no longer feasible even in theory. The fire had spread too far. The burning area was too extensive. Excavating it all would have required removing essentially the entire subsurface of the affected part of town, millions of cubic yards of material, at a cost that was now estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars. The ship, in the view of most government analysts, had sailed. The fire could not be stopped. The question was no longer how to extinguish the fire but what to do with the people who lived above it. The federal answer, when it came, was relocation. In 1983, Congress appropriated $42 million for the purchase of properties in Centralia and the voluntary relocation of residents. The program was officially voluntary, no one would be forced to leave. Residents could accept the government's offer for their property and move, or they could decline and stay. For many residents, the offer was an unexpected relief. After years of uncertainty and fear, the prospect of a buyout, a chance to sell their home at a fair government-assessed price and start somewhere else, was genuinely welcome. Some residents had already been living with significant health anxieties, concerned about their exposure to carbon monoxide and other combustion gases. For these families, the relocation program was the exit they had needed. But for others, the arrival of federal relocation money felt like something very different. It felt like the end. Because if the government was paying to move everyone out, it meant that the government had concluded that Centralia was not going to be saved. It meant that the decision had been made, somewhere in an office in Washington or Harrisburg, that this place, this town, these streets, these churches, these cemeteries, was simply going to be abandoned. That conclusion, even if practically inevitable, was deeply painful for many residents. Particularly for those who had been fighting for years for a different outcome, for a real solution, for excavation, for fire suppression, for something that would allow them to stay. The voluntary relocation created its own social fractures within the community. Neighbors who had been friends for decades found themselves on different sides of a difficult divide. Those who accepted the buyout and prepared to leave were sometimes seen by those who planned to stay as abandoning the community, giving up too easily, accepting a defeat that might have been avoided. Those who stayed were sometimes seen by those who left as refusing to face reality, staying out of stubbornness rather than wisdom, putting their families at risk for the sake of an attachment that the fire had already made impossible to sustain. These are the kinds of wounds that don't easily heal. The community of Centralia, already diminished by decades of industrial decline, was now fracturing along the lines of an impossible choice. House by house, family by family, the town began to empty. Part 6: The Holdouts. What does it mean to refuse to leave? In the case of Centralia, the answer was different for every family that stayed after the relocation program began. There was no single reason, no unified ideology of resistance. There was only the fact of staying, the daily choice, repeated over weeks and months and then years, to remain in a place that the government had decided was no longer viable. Some of those who stayed were elderly people for whom the difficulty of moving to a new place, of leaving behind the familiar geography of a lifetime, was simply too great. Not merely logistically difficult, though it was that too, but existentially difficult. A woman in her 80s who had lived in the same house for 60 years, who had raised her children in those rooms, who had sat by the same window to watch the same changing of the seasons across the same view of the hills. What did it mean to ask her to leave all of that? To start somewhere new, in a place that held no memory, no echo of her life? Some who stayed were motivated by anger, a specific, focused anger at the process by which the relocation had been handled, at the sense that the government had given up on Centralia without exhausting every possible alternative. These residents felt that they had been failed by the agencies that had not acted quickly enough in the 1960s, by the state and federal officials who had allowed the situation to deteriorate over 2 decades before finally deciding that relocation was the only option. Having been failed once, they were not inclined to trust the solution now being offered. And some stayed because of the church. St. Ignatius Roman Catholic Church stood at the center of Centralia's remaining community life through the relocation years. It was not merely a building, though the building itself, with its stone walls and arched windows and the cool, incense-scented interior that had been gathering the prayers of generations, was a significant presence. It was the institution through which the remaining community organized its collective existence. Sunday Mass was the social event of the week, the moment when those who remained could see each other and affirm, simply by their presence, that the community was still alive. Father Edward Kehoe, who served St. Ignatius through the difficult years of the 1980s, was a central figure in the life of the holdout community. He was a practical man as well as a spiritual one, and he understood that the question of whether to stay or go was not only a question of safety or finances. It was a question of identity and faith and community, and that those dimensions of the question deserved to be taken as seriously as the geological ones. In 1992, the Pennsylvania government took a significant step that increased the pressure on the holdouts. The state invoked eminent domain, the legal authority of government to compel the purchase of private property for public use over the properties in Centralia that had not yet been voluntarily acquired through the federal buyout program. This meant that the government could, in theory, force residents to sell their properties and leave. The legal challenges that followed were complex. A small group of holdout residents challenged the eminent domain declaration, arguing that they had the right to remain in their homes as long as those homes were not immediately hazardous. Court proceedings stretched over years. In 1992, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled that the state had the authority to proceed, but the practical enforcement of the order was not immediate. By the early 1990s, the population of Centralia had fallen from the roughly 1,000 residents of 1960 to fewer than 50. The streets that had been lined with houses were now open land, the houses having been demolished after their former occupants left, the lots left as grassy clearings that slowly became indistinguishable from the surrounding fields. The built environment of the town was evaporating around the handful of families who remained. The post office in Centralia was closed. The school had been closed years earlier. The borough's zip code 17927 was officially retired by the U.S. Postal Service in 2002. When a town loses its zip code, it has lost something that is difficult to define but easy to feel. It has become, officially, less real. But the holdouts did not feel less real. They went about their lives with the particular determined ordinariness of people who are making a point simply by existing where they exist. They mowed their lawns. They tended their gardens. They attended church services. They were interviewed by journalists and documentary filmmakers with a regularity that some found exhausting and others seemed to welcome as a form of continued witness, as if being seen and recorded was a way of insisting on the continuing existence of a place that the official record had written off. Among the most prominent of the holdouts were a group of residents who challenged the eminent domain proceedings and ultimately reached a legal settlement that allowed them to remain in their homes for the duration of their natural lives. This settlement, negotiated in the late 1990s and formalized in the early 2000s, was a significant and legally unusual outcome. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania agreed that these specific individuals, given their age and the length of their residency and the depth of their connection to the community, would not be forced to leave their homes during their lifetimes. What that settlement represented was a kind of acknowledgement, however legally pragmatic and carefully hedged, that the human dimension of the Centralia situation was not simply reducible to property values and safety assessments. That some things, the length of a life spent in a place, the weight of memory, the meaning of home, are not fully captured by the categories that government agencies typically use. The holdouts of Centralia, in their quiet, daily persistence, were making a statement. Not a grand political statement, not a manifesto or a declaration. Simply the statement of living where you live, for as long as you can, because it is where you belong. That statement deserves to be heard, even now. Part 7: The Landscape of Aftermath. Walk into Centralia today, and you will find something that is difficult to describe in ordinary terms. What you encounter is not quite a ghost town, the classic image of the ghost town, the western mining settlement with its false front buildings slowly collapsing in the desert sun, has its own kind of romantic desolation that Centralia does not quite share. Centralia's desolation is quieter, greener, more ambiguous. It is the desolation of something that was once densely inhabited and is now inhabited almost entirely by nature. The street grid is still there. That is perhaps the strangest and most arresting thing about the landscape of modern Centralia. The streets were never formally removed or dismantled. They simply remained the old paving, cracked and heaved by frost and by the subtle ground movement that the fire below causes, but still recognizably streets. They follow the same routes they always followed through the valley, but now they pass through open fields rather than past the fronts of houses. Young trees have grown up in the lots where houses once stood. Pennsylvania's native flora is persistent and quick. Given 20 or 30 years without disturbance, a cleared lot becomes a tangle of young maples and sassafras and wild grape and blackberry, interrupted by patches of goldenrod and Queen Anne's lace. The houses that once occupied those lots, their foundations still present in many cases, the rectangular impressions of basements and root cellars still visible in the landscape if you know what you are looking at, are entirely hidden beneath the growth. Where there is a foundation, a local gardener sometimes planted flowers. In some lots, the remnants of ornamental plantings persist: a clump of daylilies, an old rosebush gone wild, a lilac that blooms each spring as it has bloomed for 100 springs, entirely indifferent to the disappearance of the house it once graced. The road known as Route 61 once passed directly through Centralia, connecting the town to the surrounding communities. A section of this road, about a mile in length, was closed in 1994 after the pavement became too damaged and cracked by the subsidence and heat from the fire below to be safely maintained. The abandoned section of Route 61 became, over the years, one of the most photographed features of the Centralia landscape. The old pavement is cracked in long, irregular lines that run diagonally and transversely across the road surface, creating a pattern that looks almost like a deliberate artistic composition, the geometry of destruction, the map of an invisible force working from below. In winter, steam and smoke rise from some of these cracks, visible in the cold air. In summer, the heat rising from the pavement makes the air above the road shimmer. The effect, combined with the absolute emptiness of the road, no cars, no traffic, no sound except the wind and the birds, is deeply strange. It looks like the set of a film about the end of something. Visitors, and Centralia does receive visitors, a steady stream of the curious and the history-minded and the photographically inclined often report a complex set of feelings when they encounter this landscape. There is the obvious strangeness and visual drama of the place. But there is also something else, something harder to name. A kind of melancholy that attaches to spaces where human life was once intense and is now absent. The street grid without the houses. The church still standing in the middle of open land. The fire hydrants that remain at their original positions along the former residential streets, connected to nothing, surrounded by weeds, still red. Those fire hydrants are perhaps the most quietly pointed detail in all of Centralia's landscape. They represent exactly the gap between the infrastructure of ordinary life and the life itself, the systems put in place to protect a community that no longer exists, still standing at their posts, performing a kind of maintenance of absence. The fire itself, in the landscape above ground, is visible in several ways. In addition to the steam and smoke vents that appear along the hillsides and from cracks in the old road, there are areas where the vegetation has died, where the heat from below is sufficient to prevent normal plant growth, creating patches of bare earth surrounded by the otherwise lush green of the Pennsylvania landscape. These areas shift and expand slowly over the years, marking the progression of the underground fire in a way that surface observation can track if you know what you are looking at. Geologists who have studied the Centralia fire estimate that it has, over more than 60 years, burned through an area that extends several thousand feet beneath the surface and across a significant underground footprint. The fire is believed to be moving primarily in the direction of the coal seam's dip, which is to say, following the natural incline of the geological strata. This means that the fire is not necessarily moving directly toward populated areas at the surface, but its underground geography is complex and not fully knowable from surface observation alone. The environmental legacy of the fire extends beyond the visible and the dramatic. Decades of combustion have produced an enormous quantity of greenhouse gases. The carbon dioxide and methane and sulfur compounds that the burning coal seam has been releasing into the atmosphere represent a significant, if diffuse, and largely unacknowledged, environmental cost. The Centralia fire is not unique in this. Underground coal mine fires exist in many parts of the world, including some in China that are estimated to burn far more coal annually than Centralia, but it is one of the best documented examples of a phenomenon that deserves more attention than it typically receives. The ground temperature in the most active parts of the burning area beneath Centralia has been recorded at extraordinary levels. Boreholes drilled into the seam have registered temperatures of several hundred degrees Fahrenheit at depth. The earth below the surface of a small Pennsylvania town is as hot as the interior of a kiln. And yet, on the surface, on most of the streets, on most days, it looks simply like an overgrown Pennsylvania valley. The hills are green. The sky is blue. A hawk circles lazily above the ridge. The silence is the silence of countryside, not catastrophe. Nature, with its characteristic indifference to human categories, has simply moved in and made itself comfortable in the space that the town has vacated. There is something both sad and strangely beautiful in that. The grief and the growth occurring simultaneously in the same place. Part 8. What the Fire Took. Stories from the Community. History is made of facts and dates and forces and movements, and it is also made of people. Specific, particular, unrepeatable people, with their specific lives and their specific losses. The residents of Centralia who lived through the fire years, who watched their town empty, who chose to stay or were compelled to leave, who argued at town meetings and signed petitions and had their homes tested for carbon monoxide and lay awake listening to the ground beneath their beds. These people carry stories that deserve to be held with care. Some of those stories have been recorded. Journalists and documentarians and oral historians visited Centralia over the decades and captured the testimonies of residents in their own words. Others remain only in private memory, carried by aging individuals and their descendants, not written down, not preserved in any archive. He did not complain about this, or at least he did not complain in the ways that made it into any written account. What he said, to a journalist who interviewed him in the early 1990s, was something simpler: that he missed his neighbors. That the particular community of people he had known in Centralia, people who had grown up around the same kitchen tables, who had worked alongside each other, who knew each other's families and histories and embarrassments and kindnesses, that community had dispersed to the winds of the relocation. Some went to nearby towns. Some went farther away. The web of connection that had held them together in one place was broken by the act of moving, and moving, even to somewhere nearby, made the maintenance of those connections much harder. A woman who stayed as a holdout into the 1990s described the experience of watching the houses disappear around her. She had lived on a particular block for 40 years. At the peak of the relocation, she would look out her front window and see the houses across the street being dismantled, workers with tools and machinery, pulling apart the structures that had been her neighbors' homes. The furniture had already been moved. The people had already gone. What was left was the shell of the house, the bones of it, and then even that was taken apart and carted away. In a day or two, where there had been a house that she had passed every day of her life, there was simply an empty lot. Then grass. Then, in a few seasons, young trees. She said it felt like watching people die one more time. As if the houses were the last physical trace of the people who had lived in them, and their removal was a second departure. The children who grew up in Centralia during the fire years, the generation who were children in the 1970s and teenagers in the 1980s, have a distinctive relationship to the place that is worth considering separately. For them, the fire was part of the texture of growing up. Not a disaster that happened suddenly, but a condition that was simply present, like the weather or the hills. They knew, as children know things, that something was wrong with their town. They could see the steam from the hillsides. They noticed when neighbors packed up and left. They felt the strangeness of the situation even when they didn't have the words for it. Some of those children grew up carrying a complicated relationship to the idea of home. The place that had formed them, that had given them their earliest landscapes, their first friendships, the smell of coal smoke and the sight of mist in the valley on November mornings, was also a place in the process of being unmade. Home and the loss of home were simultaneous experiences for this generation. They grew up inside a disappearance. The psychological literature on forced relocation and community dissolution is substantial, and it does not make easy reading. The loss of a community, as distinct from the loss of a home, which is itself significant, carries particular mental health consequences. The disruption of social networks, the loss of shared meaning and shared identity, the grief that has no single object but disperses across the absence of an entire way of life, these losses are real and lasting. Studies of communities displaced by dam projects, by natural disasters, by industrial accidents and their aftermath have consistently found elevated rates of depression, anxiety, and what researchers sometimes call solastalgia, the distress caused by environmental change in a place that you call home. The people of Centralia were not studied with this kind of systematic attention during the years of their displacement. They were largely left to manage their grief and their adjustment with the resources available to small, working-class, aging communities, which is to say, with the resources of their churches, their families, their own resilience, and very little else. Some former Centralia residents formed informal networks and associations in the years and decades after relocation. They organized reunions, gatherings held in community halls in nearby towns, where people who had been neighbors came together to eat and drink and remember. At these reunions, according to accounts of those who attended, there was both joy and sadness in close proximity. The joy of seeing faces that had been missed. The sadness of recognizing how many were missing, those who had died since leaving, those who had moved too far away to come back even for a day. The Centralia High School graduating classes, small, as befitted a small town, held their own reunions. Former classmates who had scattered across the country would return to the area and drive through the former town, walking the old streets, trying to locate the places they remembered. This was not always easy. When the landmarks are gone, when the house where your best friend lived is an overgrown lot, when the store where you bought candy after school is a foundation slab in the weeds, memory loses its anchor points. You are trying to navigate a landscape that exists only inside you. But the act of returning, the act of witnessing, was meaningful nonetheless. Former residents who made those journeys back to Centralia often described the experience as necessary, not pleasurable, exactly, but necessary. A form of acknowledgement. A way of saying, this was real. I was here. This place mattered. The place mattered. Part 9, The Cultural Afterlife of Centralia. There is a peculiar phenomenon that surrounds certain places of abandonment and disaster, a kind of cultural magnetism that draws artists and storytellers and the imagination of the wider public toward them long after the human drama of the place has quieted. Centralia has been the subject of this phenomenon in particularly interesting ways. The most widely known cultural echo of Centralia is almost certainly the video game and film franchise known as Silent Hill. The developers of the original Silent Hill video game, released in 1999 by the Japanese company Konami, have explicitly acknowledged that the Centralia mine fire and its visible effects on the town's landscape provided inspiration for the game's central setting, a fog-shrouded, largely abandoned American town in which mysterious fires smolder beneath the ground, smoke rises from unexpected places, and the normal world has been replaced by something uncanny and threatening. The connection between Centralia and Silent Hill is not one-to-one. Silent Hill is a work of horror fiction with supernatural elements that have no correspondence to anything in Centralia's actual history. The people of Centralia were not battling monsters. Their town was not shrouded in a supernatural fog. The comparison, if taken too literally, is unfair to the real community and its real losses. But as an observation about the visual and atmospheric qualities of a place where fire burns invisibly underground, where steam rises from ordinary ground, where an otherwise normal-looking landscape has been overlaid with something deeply strange, the inspiration is comprehensible. The 2006 film adaptation of Silent Hill was not set in Centralia, it was filmed largely in Canada, but it drew on the same imagery that made Centralia visually compelling: the cracked road, the steam vents, the empty town, the eerie combination of natural beauty and industrial catastrophe. For some former residents of Centralia, the Silent Hill connection has been a source of frustration, a feeling that the genuine human tragedy of their community was being aestheticized and turned into entertainment, reduced to a backdrop for horror fiction. For others, the attitude has been more pragmatic. The connection brought attention to Centralia's story that might not otherwise have been received, and any attention that kept the history alive was better than being forgotten entirely. The photographic record of Centralia is remarkably rich. Photographers, some professional, some amateur, have been visiting the town for decades, drawn by the visual strangeness of the landscape. The abandoned stretch of Route 61 has been photographed from so many angles, in so many seasons, under so many lighting conditions, that it has become something like an iconic American landscape, comparable, in the strange canon of American ruin photography, to the abandoned factories of Detroit or the flooded lower wards of New Orleans. These photographs, gathered in books and shared online, have introduced Centralia's story to audiences far beyond those who might encounter it through journalism or academic history. The town has also attracted what might be called dark tourism, visitors who travel specifically to sites of disaster, abandonment, or tragedy. This is a form of travel with a long history. People have visited battlefields and ruins since antiquity, but it raises genuine questions about the ethics of turning someone else's loss into an experience. In Centralia's case, the presence of tourists, particularly those who treat the town as a kind of open-air spectacle, who come to photograph the steam vents and walk the cracked road for the thrill of the uncanny, has been a source of tension with the few remaining residents. Those remaining residents, the holdouts who negotiated the right to live out their lives in Centralia, have had to coexist with a steady stream of strangers who arrive in their neighborhood not out of any connection to the place but out of curiosity about it. This is not an easy coexistence. The people who live in Centralia are not exhibits. Their homes and their daily lives are not a museum installation. And yet the cultural attention that Centralia has received over the decades has made it difficult to treat it as simply a private place, as the small, quiet community it was always intended to be. There is also a substantial body of writing about Centralia in the realm of environmental history and policy analysis. Historians and geographers and environmental scientists have used Centralia as a case study in the complex interplay between industrial development, regulatory failure, community resilience, and environmental consequence. These scholarly engagements are valuable. They situate Centralia in the broader context of American industrial history and help to explain how a situation that might seem like a local anomaly is actually connected to systems and decisions and choices that operated at every level, from the individual mine operator to the federal government. The lesson that most of these scholarly accounts draw from Centralia is not a simple one. It is not simply that coal is dangerous, or that government agencies respond too slowly, or that communities should be better protected from industrial hazards, though all of those things are true. The deeper lesson is about the complex, layered, multi-generational consequences of extractive industry, the way that the benefits of resource extraction are distributed broadly and quickly, while the costs are concentrated in specific places and on specific communities and unfold slowly, over decades, in ways that are difficult to predict and nearly impossible to fully remedy. Centralia did not happen in a day. It took 100 years to build and half a century to unmake. And the unmaking continues, the fire still burns, the population continues to dwindle, the last residents grow older. The cultural attention that Centralia receives is, in some ways, a form of partial justice and acknowledgement that this place and these people matter, that what happened here is worth understanding, that the story of a Pennsylvania mining town swallowed by its own underground resource is part of the story of America. Not a comforting part, but an essential one. Part 10, The Last Residents and the Long Goodbye. As the first decade of the 21st century gave way to the second, the population of Centralia had fallen to a number that could be counted on two hands. Census figures from 2010 recorded 7 residents. 7 people, in a town that once held more than 2,000. 7 people living on streets that had once been lined with the houses of their neighbors and the neighbors of their parents. 7 people tending their homes, keeping the grass cut, maintaining the roofs, performing the ordinary maintenance of inhabited property in a landscape that had largely been returned to nature around them. By 2020, the census count had risen slightly. A handful of residents were still present, the exact number varying depending on how you defined residency and which addresses were counted as occupied. The legal agreements that had allowed certain holdout residents to remain for the duration of their natural lives meant that the population of Centralia, such as it was, would decline not by choice but by the natural passage of time. The daily life of Centralia's remaining residents, their routines, their rhythms, the particular texture of their days has been documented sporadically in interviews in journalism over the years. What emerges from these accounts is not the dramatic story that the town's larger history might suggest, but something quieter and in some ways more interesting. The remaining residents of Centralia live, for the most part, ordinary lives. They cook their meals. They tend their gardens. They receive visitors, family members, the occasional journalist, the steady stream of curious strangers. They attend church when they can, though the congregation of St. Ignatius has long since moved its services to a parish in a neighboring community. The church building itself, St. Ignatius, the stone church with the tall steeple that has stood since 1866, remains standing. It is one of the most complete structures still present in the Centralia landscape, and its continued presence in the nearly empty townscape has a quality that is difficult to look at without feeling something. A church without a parish. A place of gathering without a gathered community. The steeple still points upward toward the same sky it has always pointed toward. The stone walls are still solid. But the life that animated the building has dispersed. The cemetery beside St. Ignatius is still maintained. The graves are tended, by whom exactly is not always clear, but the evidence of continued care is present in the trim grass and the occasional fresh flowers on older stones. The dead of Centralia remain in Centralia even as the living have gone. In the cemetery lie generations of the families who built this town, Welsh miners and Irish laborers and Lithuanian immigrants and their American-born children and grandchildren. The names on the stones are the names that recur through the history of the community, Welsh surnames like Evans and Morgan and Williams, Irish names like Brennan and Gallagher, Slavic names that were often anglicized or simplified upon arrival in America but retained their essential identity through the phonetics of their sound. Those graves, and the care that continues to be given to them, represent something important. They represent the refusal of complete erasure. The living community of Centralia may have been dismantled, but the community of the dead, the record of who was here, who lived and worked and prayed and suffered and celebrated in this valley, that record persists. It is a thin thread connecting the present emptiness to the past fullness, but it is a real thread. Former residents of Centralia who were relocated in the 1980s and continue from where the script left off. Begin mid-sentence where it was cut, then complete part 10 fully, then write parts 11 and 12 in full, then the closing meditation, then the production notes. 1990s often express, in interviews, a continued attachment to Centralia. The time has not diminished. People who left 40 years ago and have lived elsewhere for the majority of their adult lives still refer to Centralia as home, not as a nostalgic affectation but as a genuine designation of identity. This is the phenomenon that geographers and psychologists call place attachment, and it is particularly powerful in communities where the shared experience of place was intensified by hardship and by the specific, close-knit social fabric of working-class industrial life. There are former Centralia residents living in retirement communities in the Allentown and Scranton areas, in small houses in nearby Mount Carmel and Ashland and Shamokin, who keep photographs of Centralia on their walls. A street scene from 1955. A church picnic in the 1960s. A school photograph from the early 1970s, 30 or 40 children arranged in rows, their faces bright and unaware of what is coming. These photographs are held as carefully as any family heirloom, more carefully, in some cases, because they are irreplaceable. There are no more photographs being made of Centralia as it was. The world that those images capture exists now only in the photographs and in the memories of the people who lived it. When those people are gone, that world will exist only in the photographs. This is the particular poignancy of communities that disappear not through conquest or catastrophe that destroys everything at once, but through the slow attrition of relocation and death and the passage of time. The loss is not sudden. It is gradual, incremental, nearly invisible from any single vantage point. Each individual departure, each family that packed its belongings and drove away from Centralia for the last time, was a small event, personal and quiet. But accumulated over years and decades, those small events amounted to the complete dissolution of a community that had existed for more than a century. There is a word in Welsh, heraeth, that has no precise English equivalent, but which carries a meaning something like a longing for a home that no longer exists, or perhaps never existed in quite the way you remember it. It is grief mixed with nostalgia, the ache of belonging somewhere you cannot return to. Given that many of Centralia's earliest and most enduring families were Welsh miners who brought their language and their culture from the coalfields of Wales, it seems fitting to reach for a Welsh word to describe what Centralia has become for those who remember it. Heraeth. A word that holds the shape of the missing thing without filling it. The borough's government, such as it is, has continued to function in a skeletal form. There is an elected council, though with almost no residents to elect it. There is a mayor, a role that has been held in recent years by the same individuals who are among the last residents, giving the position a somewhat circular quality, the last citizens governing themselves, maintaining the civic forms of a community in the absence of a community. The Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection continues to monitor the mine fire. Annual monitoring reports are filed, boreholes are maintained, temperature readings are taken, gas concentrations are measured. The fire's extent is mapped and remapped as it continues to spread through the underground coal seams, following its own invisible geography, burning through carbon that was laid down when the world was young and will eventually consume it all. The cost of the Centralia situation in direct government expenditure on the relocation program, on monitoring and remediation efforts, on administrative costs over the decades has been estimated at well over $40 million in federal funds alone, with additional state expenditures on top of that. This is the price, in dollars, of the failure to address the fire adequately in its early years, the accumulated cost of 2 decades of insufficient action, paid out in government spending and in the unmeasurable currency of human disruption. The coal beneath Centralia continues to burn. Geologists who have studied the fire's progression estimate that it could continue burning for another century or more, that there is sufficient coal in the affected seams to sustain the fire well into the 22nd century. By that time, everyone who ever knew Centralia as a living town will be gone. The photographs will have faded. The heraeth will have passed with its last bearers into whatever comes after memory. And the fire will still be burning in the dark. Part 11, The Deeper History, What Centralia Tells Us. There is a moment, in the telling of a story like this one, when it becomes necessary to step back from the particular, the specific town, the specific fire, the specific families, and consider what the story means in a larger sense. Not to lose the particular, which is the most precious thing about it, but to understand why it matters beyond the boundaries of Columbia County, Pennsylvania. Centralia is, in the most fundamental sense, a story about the relationship between a place and the thing it was built to provide. The coal beneath Centralia was not discovered by the people who built the town. It was discovered by industrialists and investors and engineers who came from outside, who recognized the economic potential of what lay beneath those particular hills, and who organized the extraction of that potential with the tools and capital at their disposal. The town that grew around the mines was, in a very real sense, a byproduct of the extraction process, a necessary accommodation of the human beings required to do the underground work, but a byproduct nonetheless. This is not a unique situation. It is, in fact, one of the most common patterns in American economic history. The extractive enterprise that creates a community as a side effect of its primary purpose, and then leaves that community to fend for itself when the extraction is complete or becomes uneconomical. The coal towns of Appalachia, and there were hundreds of them, from Pennsylvania through West Virginia and Kentucky and Tennessee and into Alabama, were built on this model. So were the copper mining towns of Arizona and Montana, the silver towns of Nevada and Colorado, the lumber towns of the Pacific Northwest, the oil towns of Texas and Oklahoma. The American landscape is littered with the remains of communities that grew around an extractive enterprise and were left behind when that enterprise moved on. What makes Centralia distinctive among these cases is not the abandonment itself, that was common enough, but the cause and the nature of the abandonment. The fire. The invisible, persistent, unstoppable combustion of the very material that had built the community. There is something almost mythological in that, the resource that gave the town its reason for being, burning beneath it, consuming not the coal that had already been extracted and used, but the coal that remained, the coal that was still in the ground, the coal that the earth had kept as a kind of reserve. It calls to mind, if you are inclined to think in those terms, the old stories of gifts that carry a curse. The treasure that destroys its possessor. The fire stolen from the gods that scorches the thief. These are very old patterns of human narrative, and Centralia fits them with an exactness that is striking, though the fit is unintentional and entirely geological. The policy failures that allowed the Centralia fire to grow from a containable problem to an uncontrollable one are well documented and well understood at this point, and they reflect broader patterns in American environmental and regulatory history that persist to the present day. The initial failure was one of cost-benefit analysis conducted at the wrong scale. In 1962, when the fire was new and still small, the cost of comprehensive excavation and suppression was estimated at a few $1 million. That cost seemed high, relative to the immediate urgency as perceived by the agencies involved. What those agencies did not factor in, could not easily factor in, given the analytical tools of the era, was the cost of inaction over time, the decades of monitoring, the relocation program, the legal proceedings, the environmental impact, the human cost of community dissolution. A narrow calculation of immediate expenditure led to decisions that were far more costly in the long run. This pattern, the preference for deferring costs that can be deferred, even when deferral makes the ultimate cost much greater, is one of the most persistent features of policymaking around environmental issues. It shows up in decisions about infrastructure maintenance, about floodplain management, about contaminated site remediation, about climate policy. The preference for the visible cost of action over the invisible cost of inaction is deeply embedded in how human institutions make decisions, and Centralia is one of the clearest and most legible examples of what happens when that preference prevails. This failure of communication bred reasonably, given the circumstances, a deep distrust of government agencies and their assessments. If you are not told the full truth about the danger you are living above, you have every reason to question the motives behind the information you are given, and to resist decisions that are presented to you without the context you need to evaluate them. The opposition to relocation that some Centralia residents expressed was not simply irrational attachment to a dangerous place. It was, in part, the rational response of people who had learned, over years of experience, that the authorities did not always tell them everything they needed to know. The third dimension of what Centralia tells us is about the nature of industrial community and its dissolution. The anthropology of working-class industrial communities, the sociology of places like Centralia, reveals something important about the human costs of economic transformation that is often missed in the aggregate statistics of economic change. When an industry declines or a factory closes or a mine ceases operation, the human cost is not simply the loss of income, however serious that is. The human cost includes the dissolution of the social structures that organized people's lives, the networks of mutual support and shared identity and collective meaning that were built around the shared experience of work. In Centralia, as in coal towns throughout the anthracite region, the shared experience of mining, the specific dangers and specific solidarities of underground labor, the particular pride of doing difficult and necessary work, the culture that had grown up around the mines over generations, was the foundation of community identity. When the mines closed and the work disappeared, something more than employment was lost. A way of being together was lost. A vocabulary of shared reference was lost. A set of rituals and institutions and informal structures that had given shape to daily and seasonal life was lost. The fire accelerated and completed a process of dissolution that the industrial decline had already begun. By the time the relocation program arrived, many of the social structures that had once made Centralia's communities so resilient had already been weakened by decades of economic pressure. The relocation finished the job. And yet, and this is worth emphasizing, the community did not simply cease to exist. It was scattered, yes. Its physical substrate was removed. Its daily rhythms were disrupted and ultimately ended. But the people who made up that community carried it with them, in their memories and their family stories and their sense of themselves, into wherever they went. They carried Centralia's particular version of what it means to be from somewhere, the specific accents and habits and ways of seeing the world that valley and those mines had produced, and they carried it forward in their children and grandchildren, even when those children and grandchildren had no direct experience of the place. Community, in this sense, is not identical to place. It is related to place, deeply and fundamentally. But it can survive the loss of place, in diminished and transformed form, in the people who remember. That is not consolation. It is not enough. But it is something. The coal that came out of Centralia's mines heated cities and powered factories across the eastern United States for more than a century. The people who lived in Centralia, and who live in communities like Centralia throughout the region, provided the labor and bore the risks and lived in proximity to the environmental harms that made that energy production possible. And when the industry declined and the fires burned, those same communities were left with the consequences: the polluted land, the unstable ground, the empty streets, the dispersed families, the truncated lives. The distance between who benefits from an extractive economy and who pays its costs is one of the defining tensions of industrial modernity. Centralia makes the tension visible in an unusually clear and physical way. The fire beneath the ground is a permanent, ongoing reminder that the costs of coal extraction were not paid only in the wages of the miners or the price of the coal at market. They were also paid, are still being paid, in the slow combustion of a community. There is no clean ending to this analysis, and it would be dishonest to offer one. The systems that produced Centralia's fate are large and complex and deeply rooted in American economic and political culture. They did not begin with the Centralia mine fire and they did not end with it. Understanding them is important. Naming them matters. But naming them does not undo the loss. The streets of Centralia, empty and overgrown, are the most eloquent statement about that loss that any policy paper or academic analysis could offer. You do not need to read the reports to understand what happened here. You need only walk those streets, in any season, and look at what is there and listen to what is absent. The silence says everything. Part 12, What Remains, Memory, Meaning, and the Fire That Will Not Go Out. There is a particular quality to late autumn light in the Pennsylvania mountains. It comes low and golden through the bare trees, illuminating the hillsides with a warmth that is all the more beautiful for being temporary, the last richness before the gray settling of winter. The ridges stand clear and close against the sky, and the air carries the smell of fallen leaves and cold earth and the particular mineral clarity of a November afternoon at elevation. If you stood at the edge of what was once Centralia on such an afternoon, the scene would have a kind of painful beauty. The overgrown lots, still showing the faint geometry of the old street grid beneath their cover of grass and young trees. The church steeple catching the low light. The old road running off through the scrub, its cracked surface catching a glint of steam in the cold air. The silence that is not quite complete, a crow somewhere on the ridge, the wind moving through the dry grasses, the almost imperceptible sounds of the earth itself. In that silence, something remains. Not the town, as a functioning human community, is effectively gone. But something else. The weight of what was. The accumulated presence of all the lives that were lived in this place, leaving their invisible impressions on the landscape, on the air, on the particular character of a silence that is the silence of something ended rather than something never begun. Memory is the word we reach for first, and it is the right word, but it is also an insufficient one. Memory implies a subject, someone who remembers. And as the last witnesses to Centralia's life as a living community grow old and pass away, the question of what remains after memory is one that the story of this place forces us to confront. What remains is several things. There is the physical record, the photographs and the documentary films and the oral history interviews and the newspaper articles and the academic studies. These form a body of evidence about Centralia that will persist in archives and digital repositories long after the last person who walked these streets as a resident is gone. They are an imperfect record, as all human records are imperfect, selective, shaped by the interests and perspectives of those who made them, incomplete in the ways that any documentation of a human life is incomplete. But they exist. They can be consulted. They ensure that Centralia will not simply vanish from the historical record. There is the geological record, the fire itself, burning on through its underground seam, an ongoing physical fact that requires no human memory to persist. The fire does not need anyone to remember it. It simply continues, following the coal through the dark earth, maintaining its own existence through the simple chemistry of carbon and oxygen and heat. In this sense, the most permanent trace of Centralia's history is not a building or a document but a geological event, the consequence of a moment in 1962 when a flame met a coal seam and the resulting combustion proved impossible to stop. There are the former residents themselves, and their children and grandchildren, the living human chain of connection to what Centralia was. These individuals, distributed across the towns and cities of Pennsylvania and beyond, carry Centralia in specific and particular ways. A way of speaking. A particular recipe passed down through a grandmother's kitchen. A set of stories told at family gatherings about people and places and events that the younger generation never experienced directly but absorbs through the medium of family narrative. This is how communities persist beyond their physical dissolution, not as intact institutions but as threads in the fabric of families, informing identity and memory without being visible to any outside observer. And there is the cultural inheritance, the broader social awareness of Centralia's story, which has grown and diversified over the decades through the journalism and the documentaries and the artistic references and the policy discussions. This awareness is diffuse and often inaccurate in its particulars. The Silent Hill connection, for instance, has lodged a version of Centralia in popular imagination that bears only a superficial resemblance to the actual history of the community. But even imperfect awareness is better than none. Even the person who knows Centralia only as the place that inspired Silent Hill has been given a hook on which to hang more accurate and more substantial knowledge, if they choose to seek it. The question of what Centralia means, what it should mean, what we are meant to take from it, is one that different people have answered differently, and that complexity is appropriate. Simple morals are rarely equal to complex histories. For some, Centralia is primarily a cautionary tale about regulatory failure, a clear demonstration of what happens when government agencies prioritize short-term costs over long-term consequences, when the communities most affected by industrial hazards are the least empowered to compel adequate responses. In this reading, Centralia is an argument for stronger environmental regulation, for better funded agencies with genuine enforcement capacity, for a more precautionary approach to industrial hazards in communities that lack the political and economic resources to protect themselves. For others, Centralia is a story about community resilience and the limits of resilience, about the extraordinary adaptability and persistence of human beings in difficult circumstances, and also about the point at which external forces are simply too large and too sustained to be resisted. The people of Centralia did not fail. They managed, for decades, to maintain a community life under conditions that would have disintegrated many less rooted communities. The fact that they ultimately could not prevent the dissolution of their town is not a failure of their resilience but a measure of how overwhelming the forces arrayed against them were. For others still, Centralia is a meditation on impermanence, on the fragility of the human constructions we call home and community and town, and on the geological timescales within which all human settlement is a brief and provisional enterprise. The mountains that ring the Centralia Valley were old before the first human being arrived in North America. The coal seam that burns beneath the former town was laid down when the continents were arranged differently and the ancestors of humanity were something other than human. In geological time, Centralia, its founding, its flowering, its fire, its dissolution, is less than a blink. The fire itself, burning perhaps for another century, will still be a blink. There is something quietly humbling in that perspective, though it should not be allowed to dissolve the very real and very human importance of what was lost. Geological time is not the time in which human lives are lived and human communities are built and human losses are mourned. 150 years of a community's existence is not diminished by the fact that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. the lives that were lived in Centralia mattered. The morning shifts and the Sunday masses and the baseball games in summer and the coal-heated kitchens in winter and the songs that rose from the church choirs and the arguments at town meetings and the children playing in the woods above the valley, all of it mattered. Not because it was recorded, not because it persists in any physical form, but because it happened. Because it was real. Because the people who lived it were real, with their real joys and their real sorrows and their real attachment to this particular piece of earth. That reality does not require geological permanence to be valid. In the summer of any recent year, you can still visit the site of Centralia. The Pennsylvania Highway Department maintains a route through the area, and the former borough is accessible by road. There are no signs welcoming you. The borough government has, with characteristic ambivalence, neither encouraged nor entirely discouraged visitors. The old street names are still marked on some corners, the faded aluminum signs slightly bent by winters and untended by anyone, pointing toward intersections that no longer have houses on their corners. If you walk the old streets in summer, the vegetation is dense and green and full of birdsong, warblers and thrushes moving through the young trees, dragonflies hovering over the patches of wet ground where the fire's heat has created unusual moisture conditions. The landscape is alive in the biological sense, genuinely and beautifully alive, even as it is empty in the human sense. In certain spots, you can feel the warmth rising from the ground beneath you, a faint but unmistakable warmth on the soles of your feet, a warmth that has no business being there on a cool morning, a warmth that comes from very far below. In those spots, the smoke sometimes rises from cracks in the earth, thin wisps, barely visible in warm weather but unmistakable on cold days, curling up from the ground and dissipating in the mountain air. The fire below does not feel menacing in that moment, standing above it on a summer morning with the birds singing and the light falling warm through the trees. It feels ancient and strange and very large. It feels like something that is simply what it is, a chemical process occurring in the deep earth, beyond caring, beyond meaning, simply burning through the carbon that was placed there 300 million years ago and will be placed nowhere again. The last residents of Centralia lived their days in proximity to this, to the emptiness and the warmth and the smoke and the overgrown streets. Their lives are ordinary in the ways that all lives are ordinary from the inside, the making of meals, the maintenance of property, the visiting of family, the small decisions that fill a day. But their address is extraordinary. They live where a town used to be. They live above a fire that has been burning since before they were born. They live at the intersection of geological time and human time, where the vast impersonal forces of the earth have met and changed the very personal, very human story of a community. There is something quietly extraordinary about that. About the decision, however it was arrived at, for whatever combination of reasons, to remain in the place you have always been, to let your life continue on its terms in a landscape that has been radically altered around you, to tend your garden and watch the seasons change and feel the warmth rising from the earth beneath your feet and simply go on. Simply going on is not the stuff of great historical drama. It does not make headlines. It does not inspire documentaries in the way that disaster does. But it is, perhaps, the most deeply human of all the responses to the story of Centralia, more human than the fire itself, more human than the regulatory failures, more human than the political debates about relocation and eminent domain. The act of continuing to exist in a place that history has declared finished. Of saying, simply by being there, not yet. The fire burns on beneath the ground. The seasons turn above it. The hills, ancient and patient, hold the valley in their curve. The birds come back in spring, as they always come back, indifferent to everything that has happened to the ground below them, concerned only with the living business of flight and song and the making of nests in the branches of trees that have grown up where houses used to stand. Time moves differently in places like this. It moves the way it moves through old stone, the way it moves through deep earth, slowly, and with great weight, and without particular regard for what human beings have decided about it. The people who lived in Centralia were real. Their joys and their griefs were real. Their attachment to that valley and those hills and those streets and those neighbors was real, and remains real in whatever form memory can hold after the physical world that held it has been altered beyond recognition. Their story deserves to be remembered. Not as a horror story, not as a curiosity, not as a backdrop for entertainment, but as a human story, complicated, sad, full of courage and failure and love and loss, and finally irreducible to any single lesson or meaning. Just a story. A real one. About real people, in a real place, living through something that was larger than they were and doing their best to hold their lives together in the midst of it. That is enough. That is, in fact, a great deal. Closing meditation. Breathe in slowly now. Feel the surface beneath you firm and steady, supporting you completely. You are not in that valley. You are not above that fire. You are here, in your own place, in your own warmth, in the quiet of wherever this night has found you. But you have visited Centralia tonight, in the slow and gentle way that stories allow. You have walked its streets when they were full, and felt the warmth of its kitchens and the sound of its churches and the weight of the mountain air that settled over it on long summer evenings. You have sat with its people in the difficult years, and listened to the choices they made in impossible circumstances. You have felt the ground grow warm beneath you, slowly, over many years. And now you can let that landscape drift, like smoke rising from a winter hillside, rising, dispersing, becoming part of the wider air. Let your body grow heavy now. Let your shoulders settle. Let your hands rest open. Let your breathing become the rhythm of sleep, slow, regular, unhurried. The hills of Pennsylvania are quiet tonight. Whatever fire burns in the dark earth below them burns as it has always burned, slowly, invisibly, beyond the reach of sleep or waking. The birds are still on their branches. The old streets are empty and silver in the moonlight. The cemetery beside the stone church is peaceful, the names on the stones worn soft by weather, the grass settled and cold. Somewhere, the last light in the last house goes dark. And the valley holds its quiet. Let yourself go now, the way a town lets itself go back to the mountain. Slowly. Gently. Without resistance. The story is complete for tonight. The people are at rest. The fire tends to itself in the dark. And you are here warm and safe, and held by whatever surface is holding you, drifting now toward the deep, unhurried country of sleep. Let the hills receive you. Let the quiet take you. Sleep well. If you're still awake, that's okay. Just close your eyes and let the story carry you. Subscribe to History for Sleep for a new story every week. Sweet dreams.